day with just one person, who would it be? Someone tell me, who would you choose? Yeah, Jesus is a great answer. I pointed to you because you're my husband, and I really hoped you would have picked me then. But Jesus is a better answer. Yeah, this question haunted me in the desperate hope that someone, not God, would choose me. It meant that when I walked into a room, I was immediately thinking about what people in it thought of me, whether they liked me, whether they didn't, how I could win love from them, how I could attract their attention, not in a romantic way, just a deep longing to know that I was loved. And if you'd have asked one of my friends what I was like at that time, they probably would have told you that I was fun to hang out with, I hope, but tiring over long stretches of time, that I took more than I gave, and that I was quite an attention-seeking person. And I was still Christian at that time. I'd been baptized, I'd given my life to God, but that wasn't really reflected in how I acted. You probably could know me for a while before knowing that I was Christian, unless you happened to see me reading my Bible or wandering down to church on a Sunday. But just after Christmas, in my first year of uni, my church went away together for a weekend, and I went with them. And during one of those sessions, we were asked if there were any deep hurts that we had to let go of. And I brushed off the question at first, thinking there couldn't be anything there. I'd dealt with secondary school long ago and had moved on. But as I prayed, God brought to mind those lies I'd been told throughout year 7, that I was hated, and he brought to mind the question that I was desperate to have answered. And for the first time, I was able to put 2 and 2 together and understand where that had come from. So I did what I thought I was supposed to do and prayed to forgive that person and so on and so forth, and thought I was done and went to get lunch. But that evening, as I was worshipping God, a picture came into my mind, which I think is going to appear on the screen. Ta-da! This is a PowerPoint version of the picture that I got. God is a better drawer than I am. For those of you that haven't experienced that before, God speaking to you in a picture, God often speaks to people through images in the Bible, either for them personally or as a prophetic image meant for someone else. And in this case, I knew that this image was meant for me. I saw myself as an 11-year-old, that's the red one there, surrounded by people from my secondary school. But around me there was a circle, and then a bigger circle around that. And no one from my past was able to get inside that circle. And I asked God what the picture meant, and I felt him say to me that he was that donut. And I was like, great, I love donuts. And he said that the outside line was him, how even then he'd been protecting me, that he was protecting me now. And I thought that that made sense. As bad as it was, I had always been able to cling to God, and had felt, even at the time, that he was protecting me from the worst. But if that was the case, if God was that donut, why was I cut off from him as well? What was that, all that space between me and God? So I asked him, and what he said next I've never forgotten. Gently spoken, but clear as day, the words appeared in my mind. That was a barrier you created yourself by refusing to be satisfied in my love for you, and instead looking to other people. And all at once I understood that all those years I'd been seeking an answer to that question, if you could spend the day with just one person, who would it be? I'd refused to let God answer it, believing that he couldn't, and instead throwing myself into intense friendship after intense friendship, desperately trying to find love in the people around me. I'd actually been refusing to let God's love satisfy my needy heart. And so I took a breath, and I simply said, God, I don't want there to be a barrier between us. Please show me how much you love me. And then that question I'd been haunted by appeared once again in my mind, as if it had been written out, and I saw it in my head expand and expand, bigger and bigger, until it burst and was no more. And suddenly I felt this huge weight crashing down on me, not unfriendly, but totally overwhelming. And I felt more tired than I have ever felt. And that's honestly the only way I can describe it. It was like even the tiny bit that God had showed me was too overwhelming, too wide, too long, too high, and too deep for me to comprehend, but it had fully satisfied my soul. And about 2 weeks later, after I'd got back to uni, one of my friends that didn't know Jesus came up to me and said, "Rachel, I don't know what's happened, but for about 2 weeks now, it's like you've not been a different person, but you've changed." So I asked them what they meant, and they said this: "It's like you've been more still." And that was exactly what had happened. Before, when I'd entered a room, my thoughts had been racing. Who in this room likes me? Who can I win over? What can I do to earn love from these people? But now, even if it had just been 2 weeks, I walked into a room already deeply knowing that God loved me. And his love was so wide, so high, so long, and so deep that there was no yearning left that spilled out to those around me. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Instead of yearning spilling out for the first time in my life, instead of focusing on what love I could get, I could actually focus on how I could love well the people around me. And that was what my friend had picked up on. My soul had been satisfied. And that change was a natural one that happened when I experienced, even in part, how deeply satisfying and life-changing God's love is. And so when I think of all this, I fall to my knees and I pray to the Father, the creator of everything in heaven and on earth. I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you'll be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. Paul prays, may you experience the love of Christ, then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. So if experiencing God's love makes us complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God, then what I want to know is, why isn't the whole of Ephesians just this passage? Why does Paul bother writing the rest of the book of Ephesians if God's love is all we need in order to have the fullness of life? Why bother teaching us not to lie or to stay away from sexual immorality if we can be transformed just by knowing God's love for us? I don't think it will be a surprise to many of you that knowing God's love doesn't suddenly make you a perfect version of yourself. It's not like you experience the depth of God's love and suddenly instinctively know the answer to every moral dilemma that there is. So what is it that Paul means here, and why does he put this passage in the middle of his teachings on how to live? So looking back for a moment to 18-year-old me, who had just experienced God's love in a significant way, that wasn't the only time I experienced God's love, but it was one that stood out in my walk with him. There had been a change that had taken place in me. Even my friends that didn't know Jesus had seen it, but that didn't suddenly make me a perfect person. It didn't mean I suddenly inherently knew what things would prosper me and what things would cause me harm. But there was no denying that a change had happened. Let's look again at what Paul says. Now all glory to God, who is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. Through his mighty power at work within us. Aha, thank you, Paul, for that present tense verb. All glory to God, who is able, through his mighty power that is currently at work within us. This word in Greek is energeo, or energio, I'm not actually sure on the pronunciation. I did biblical Hebrew at uni, not ancient Greek. But in present tense, this means it's to be in action. This transformation that Paul's talking about isn't something that happens once and that's you done, a finished Christian. It's a present tense, transforming power that is only possible because of continuous relationship with a God who will show you his love continuously. And this Christmas, I discovered a new all-time favourite musical, which Paul Seth has had to listen to me sing constantly, even now, despite the fact it's February and it's a musical based on A Christmas Carol. It's called Spirited. Has anyone here seen that? Nice. It's so good. Yeah. Well, if you don't want any spoilers, then cover your ears. But like I said, it's based on A Christmas Carol. And Scrooge wants to know if he's unredeemable. Because even though he was changed, supposedly overnight, he still wants to do bad things sometimes. And isn't that so relatable to us? Unfortunately for Scrooge and for us, they discover that, like we've talked about, the change that happens is more than one night. It's an everyday decision. In fact, there's a whole song about it. It's really good, definitely worth a watch, even in February. And the same is true for us in our relationship with God. It's an everyday decision. We don't just get to experience God's love for us once. We get to live in it every day. But part of that means making a choice every day. And that's a choice to step into God, not away from him. It's like, say you go out on a date with someone. Is that one date, even if it's the best date in the world, going to be enough to sustain your relationship for the rest of your life? Probably not. You don't stop going on dates after your first one. You keep on going and making the time for each other because you know it will build up your relationship. And you know if you never did go on another date after that first one, then the chances are you probably wouldn't stay together very long. Building a relationship takes more than a moment, doesn't it? So what does that look like? What does it look like to choose a relationship? Understand why? And I choose to follow it because having experienced the love of God, I love him too, and I want to honor him with my life and make decisions that will bring me closer to him. And that's why Paul puts this passage in the middle of his letter to the Ephesians. Because in his teachings about how we should live if we want the fullness of life, our motivation, our foundation behind why we do those things is this path to the fullness of life. So I'm going to invite the worship band to come back up, please. And we're going to have time to respond in a couple of ways. So the first thing the first way I'd like us to respond is to spend a moment and just ask God if there's anywhere in your life where your actions aren't that of someone who knows deeply that they're loved by God. And it might be that, like 18-year-old me, that's expressing itself in a moment of insecurity or in your focus in a room. Or it might be that there are situations you walk into with a victim mentality instead of the mentality of a loved son or daughter of God. Or it could be that there are times that the decisions you make are made without God's love being at the foundation of your decision. So I want us to spend a moment just to ask God if there's anything where your actions aren't that of someone who knows that they're deeply loved by him. And if there's anything that comes to the surface that you'd like to receive prayer for, I'd love to invite you to come to the front. And the second group of people I'd love to encourage to receive prayer at the front is if you've never experienced God's love before in that tangible way, or you feel like you haven't met with God that way in a while. And it doesn't have to look like my experience. God's shown his love to me in a myriad of ways, and I'm sure there's an infinite more because God's love is infinite. But if you feel like you haven't experienced that or haven't in a while and would like to, then please come to the front when the music starts, and our prayer team would love to pray for you because we believe that when we ask God to show us his love, he does. So whether this is your first time here or thousandth time here, it doesn't matter. You're welcome all the same. Over to you, Mikey.